The Russian army is facing a serious shortage of recruits as intense fighting continues in Ukraine. There are no prisoners left to send, and there are few men from the poorest rural areas of Russia who, even though the pay is huge, want to enlist voluntarily in the army. That is why Russia is using increasingly controversial strategies to send soldiers to the front lines. In this video, we will discuss the expansion of the soldier recruitment process for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the closing of prisons due to lack of prisoners, and how many Russians and foreigners are deceived and pressured to go fight in Ukraine. In a war, the problems faced by the nations involved are many, but there is one very serious issue that can make the difference between victory and defeat. I am referring to troop rotation and the maintenance of a constant flow of fighters at the front line. Despite the extreme mechanization and automation of combat in the 21st century, hundreds of thousands of soldiers are still needed on the battlefield. Keeping so many men at the front line is an immense logistical challenge, and this can be seen in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. According to various sources, there are currently around 1 million soldiers in combat between Russians and Ukrainians. Each side is suffering hundreds of casualties daily among the dead and wounded, not counting the hundreds of soldiers that need to be replaced each day, whether at the end of their service period or in the usual process of rotating fighters. These huge numbers raise a question: how do Russia and Ukraine replace their losses and maintain a constant flow of soldiers at the front line? For Ukraine, which is the attacked nation, this is much simpler and easier than for Russia. This is because when a nation is attacked by another country, it enters a special state of government. Laws are usually passed that give the president expanded powers to deal with the crisis caused by a foreign invasion. Among these additional powers can be the mandatory mobilization of reservists. That is exactly what happened in Ukraine after the Russian invasion on February 24th, 2022. Since that day, Ukraine has been under martial law, with all men aged 25 or older being automatically called up. This is a perfectly normal measure in the context of a foreign invasion. For Ukraine, it is relatively simple and quick to have soldiers for its defensive effort. In practice, any man between 25 and 55 years old is eligible to go to war. The Ukrainian government, whenever necessary, can draw on a huge pool of around 10 million men perfectly fit for combat. However, in the case of Russia, despite having a potential stock of soldiers almost 5 times larger, taking these men to war is a much more complex process, due to an unusual detail. Officially, the Russian government does not recognize a state of war with Ukraine. It is the largest conflict on European soil since the end of World War II, involving thousands of armored vehicles and over 1 million soldiers. But still, Vladimir Putin insists on calling it a mere special military operation. This means that Putin cannot do what Ukrainian President Zelensky can do, who can simply reach out and take the men needed to replace their losses. To replace his troops, Putin has only 3 options: mercenaries, mandatory mobilization, and contract soldiers. And some of those options are already running out. Let's look at just one example. According to the Russian newspaper Kommersant, citing Russian Commissioner Mark Denisov, various Russian prisons in several regions have had to close since 2023 due to lack of inmates. The article does not specify the exact number of prisons closed, only mentioning that there were many and they were in different regions of Russia. But why are there so few prisoners in that country? In this war, Russia has always faced a big challenge, overcoming the defensive lines that the Ukrainians have established around their major cities. This was mainly evident in Bakhmut. The assault there was assigned to mercenaries from the Wagner Group, then led by Yevgeny Prigozhin. To overcome the Ukrainian defenses, the Russians needed a large number of infantry soldiers, mainly made up of inmates recruited from Russian prisons. Russian prisons are known for being among the worst in the world, with terrible and unhealthy conditions run by notoriously brutal prison guards. Taking advantage of this and promising to wipe their criminal records clean, Prigozhin recruited over 40,000 inmates. They were used in the offensive against Bakhmut from December 2022 to May 2023. This offensive included the tactic of human waves, with units thrown against the Ukrainian defenses one after another, a tactic that only works when the commander has disposable soldiers at their disposal, which in the case of the Bakhmut offensive were the Russian inmates. This tactic worked so well that the Russian army decided to adopt it, with Vladimir Putin authorizing Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu to recruit inmates to fill the ranks of his army. There are no official data on the exact number of inmates recruited from Russian prisons, but if at the beginning of 2023, Prigozhin acknowledged recruiting 40,000, various sources believe that by July 2024, the total number of recruited inmates has reached 100,000. If we consider that in 2023, the prison population in Russia was around 420,000 inmates, we can say that 25% of the total was recruited and sent to war in Ukraine. There is also no official information on casualties, but based on Prigozhin's statements, who said in May 2023 that he had lost over 20,000 inmates in his offensive against Bakhmut, we can think that the casualty rate is close to 50%. This figure matches the low level of training they receive, as they are essentially disposable soldiers. According to information from Russia, these inmates do not receive a salary, with the only reward being freedom if they manage to return alive from Ukraine. With this measure, Putin is achieving two major internal advantages. The first is the reduction of costs for maintaining Russian prisons, which are quickly decreasing due to the lack of inmates. The second is obtaining a large number of disposable soldiers that Putin can use for almost suicidal missions, like testing the depth of minefields, assessing defensive strength in a sector of the front line, or being sent in successive human waves to wear down Ukrainian defenses. The problem is that there are almost no prisoners left to recruit, and Russia must look for other options to get men for its army. The second option Putin has for obtaining new soldiers is mobilization. This can only be done sporadically because, as I said, his country is not in a state of war. Additionally, mobilization is a very unpopular event in society, as seen in September 2022, when more than 300,000 Russians fled the country during a mobilization process that resulted in the recruitment of 300,000 soldiers. Putin knows that if he abuses mobilizations, he could lose control over Russian society, also opening the door to the strengthening of internal dissent that could be very harmful to his regime. The third option Putin has, and the most used now, is the hiring of soldiers. Through this option, the Russian army can only recruit men who really want to go to war, thus ensuring that, at least in principle, the men will not go unwillingly to Ukraine. However, to hire thousands of men daily just to cover losses and rotations at the front line, Putin must offer contracts with truly attractive values. He currently offers amounts close to $50,000, a fortune by Russian living standards, where the average annual salary is around $14,000. Therefore, in addition to the costs related to transportation, training, food, and equipment for the new soldiers, Putin must also pay large salaries and almost $1 million insurance to convince Russians to go to war. But besides the expense of this option, it also poses limitations. Few Russians of fighting age remain in the poorest rural regions of Russia, who, despite these huge salaries, are willing to go to war. The information about the heavy losses these contractors are suffering, sent without the slightest preparation or equipment, is well known in Russian society. Few are willing to face almost certain death in Ukraine, even though the economic incentives to do so are enormous. So, in recent months, Putin has been resorting to a new, very controversial strategy to recruit soldiers for his army. It is recruiting mercenaries from Central African countries such as Rwanda, Burundi, Congo, and Uganda. According to British military intelligence, Russia offers these recruits significant financial incentives and the promise of Russian citizenship. However, the life expectancy of these soldiers in Ukraine is very low. Many of them are deceived into going to the front lines. They join the Russian army to provide a better future for their families, and they are told they will be helpers in logistics or first aid. But then they are sent to the front lines without any preparation. Others enlist in the army completely deceived. A man from Sierra Leone explained how he paid a recruiter and flew to Russia in search of a good job to support his large family. Instead, he was tricked into joining the army. The man, a security guard, said that after signing documents in Russian, he realized he had enlisted in the military. Meanwhile, Russia has resorted to forcing thousands of African students, immigrants, and prisoners to fight alongside Russian troops. Between 35,000 and 37,000 men and women from the continent are studying in Russia thanks to various scholarship programs. It is expected that the figures will rise even further with the recent diplomatic offensive by the Kremlin in some parts of Africa. Russian officials have increasingly threatened not to extend visas for young African students and workers unless they agree to join the military. Some Africans in Russia on work visas have been detained and forced to choose between deportation or armed combat. It is quite clear that replenishing Ukrainian losses is a comparatively much simpler and faster process than Russia's. This is because the country is officially at war after being invaded. In Russia, however, since its leaders do not recognize a state of war, the replenishment process is much slower and, above all, significantly more costly. Despite having a massive advantage in terms of human resources, Putin, at least for now, does not have unrestricted access to this entire pool of potential soldiers. That concludes today's video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to check out the next one.